Safety 24/7.
Maybe you are one of those who have been labeled as an illegitimate child. But really, there is no such thing as an illegitimate child. Maybe illegitimate parents, if you will. Parents who proceed to have children out of the purview of God's will, leaving them to the whim and caprice of fallen man, to the extent that these children are left abused. We pursue our own course of action, even when it comes to parenting. But what about our children? You guessed it. Today we enter into this very significant and sensitive area of child abuse. I can't deal with this on my own, so we have invited the resident psychiatrist, that's right, Dr. Sandra Reid. I hope I got it right. Psychiatrist. Psychiatrist, Dr. Sandra Reid. Thank you once again for taking the time to be with us.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Child abuse is a field that you have been under study or studying for some time. What is child abuse, and what are the varied forms of child abuse?
All right, so we start with definitions.
Sure.
And usually when we speak of child abuse, we are speaking in the context of an adult and a child, even though we appreciate that abuse may occur between two children, or an adolescent and a child. But when we speak of child abuse, we're really talking about any situation where an adult, usually a parent or a caretaker, engages in some action, or actually it may be inaction. There may be things that they don't do, but it results usually in either physical or emotional harm, or a risk, an increased risk of harm, an unnecessarily increased risk of harm, or even death of a child.
It's interesting that you mentioned not to do.
That's right.
What are some of the things that a parent may neglect to do?
Usually this is in the area of emotional abuse, which is one of the types of abuse that can occur. So a child may report that he or she does not feel loved. And this is an example of one of those unintentional types of abuse, because a parent may be doing their very best, trying to take care of, love a child. But if that child does not feel loved, unfortunately, that may be considered a type of emotional abuse where the parent did not do something that they were supposed to do. Other types of abuse, of course, include the physical and sexual abuse, which has become very, very topical in our country now. And we should not forget neglect, which again, we were just talking about, neglect of emotional needs or neglect of physical needs.
And I suspect even in that area, neglect, more parents might be more culpable than in other areas as well.
That's right. You see, because neglect can occur in areas where parents do not think about it. Maybe I should mention here that abuse really has a cultural dimension. What is physical abuse, for example, in one culture is not in another culture. I would say that the discipline that the Caribbean parent would engage in from decades ago now would be considered definitely physical abuse. You see? So we do have to look at that cultural aspect. And culturally, my experience has shown me that we tend not to be emotionally expressive parents. That's changing, thank God, it's changing. But what you're saying is right. There may have been unintentional emotional neglect simply because of the style of parenting that has been culturally accepted.
Wow. So what are some of the possible signs and symptoms of being abused?
Okay, all right. Now, first we have to understand that there are no hard and fast signs. Okay, so anything that I share doesn't necessarily mean that a child is being abused. I guess the only hard and fast is if a child were to say to you, hey, this is happening. And hopefully we would believe the child, because children don't lie about those things, okay? But in the case of physical abuse and sometimes sexual abuse and neglect, there may be some of the obvious signs. You see bruises, you see cuts, you see wails. Children may have broken bones. In the sexually abused child, you may see evidence of let's say blood on the underwear or discharge in a young child. Similarly, neglect, you may find that a child doesn't carry lunch to school, even though you know that the parents could afford to give the child lunch. So those are some of the more obvious signs. But in the other categories of abuse, what we look for are changes in the child, him or herself. So we look at changes in behavior, for example. A child who is being abused may either become very withdrawn, quiet, And remember, we're talking about a change in behavior. So a child who's previously gregarious, happy, laughing, smiling, suddenly chooses to stick to him or herself, doesn't want to mix with the family, doesn't want to mix with his or her peers at school, or the flip side may occur in the change of behavior. You may see that the child is doing what we describe as acting out. Acting out relates to rebellious, defiant behaviors, again, that are not characteristic of the child. So a child who is sexually abused may act out sexually. So these are the children who go to school and they want to touch another child inappropriately, or they reveal their private parts inappropriately, and all of that is an expression of the abuse that they themselves might be experiencing. Children who are physically abused may act out aggressively. They are the ones who beat and punch and kick, right? And unfortunately, sometimes they are just labeled bad children, and they are punished rather than looking to see if there is possibly some underlying abuse that is taking place. So we look at the behavior, but we could also look at the child's response to the environment. Children who are abused sometimes become very, very suspicious, very hypervigilant. They tense, they jump when somebody comes into the room. Or maybe you call a meeting of the parents and mom is there and the child is fine. But as soon as dad enters the room, you notice that child has changed. They get tense and they don't want to talk. So the response to the environment also gives a cue. But remember, again, as I said, it's not foolproof. Not every child who behaves like this is being abused. Another important area we could look at, children are in school generally, right? And a change in a child's educational performance, their academic performance, may indicate as well that something is going wrong. And at the extreme, we have children who develop psychiatric illnesses. So we see the symptoms of these illnesses, and we need to look to see if abuse is the reason for the depression or for the anxiety or for the suicidal behavior.
Wow, you have listed a whole range.
Yes, so there are, in fact, a whole range of signs and symptoms, none of which we can say specific, but when you see them and they are consistent, you should have a high index of suspicion.
Notwithstanding the fact that many people who are abused, their cases are not reported.
That's right.
How real is it in Trinidad? How prevalent is child abuse in Trinidad and Tobago?
Yes, and I think we could talk to anybody and they would know of a child who they suspect or they know might have been abused. But I have some statistics from the Children's Authority. The Children's Authority was established in 2015 here in Trinidad and Tobago with the mandate to protect our children. All right, that's their general mandate. In the first 9 months of their operation, from May 2015 to February 2016, they saw 4,158 cases of children in need of care and protection. Now, I'm not sure what proportion of our child population that is, but regardless of the proportion, 4,158 children are a lot of children, right? Their data went on to state that their emergency response team rescued 300 children in that period of time. Yeah, and most of the cases that they saw, about 20%, 1 in 5, were cases of child sexual abuse.
Wow.
You see?
Wow.
So the numbers are significant.
Let's get back to the whole question of neglect in a different context.
Yeah.
At what age, and it might be a little tricky, at what age would you say it's safe to leave a child home alone?
You're right, it is tricky. Because I don't think that there is a number that we can pull up. We don't have a law in Trinidad and Tobago that gives you an age. There are some states in the United States of America, few mind you, where they have set an age. So there's one state where they say 8, there's another where they say 10 years old, another where they say 14 years old. So I mean, those are I mean, they would have had their reasons for putting those ages. But I think what is important in the context of what we're speaking about is that a parent should exercise good judgment. And what they want to avoid is neglect. They want to avoid abuse by leaving your child in a dangerous situation. Okay, so there are several things that a parent might look at, for example. So first you want to know, is this child at this age and in this situation responsible enough, mature enough to handle being alone? Okay, how do you assess that? Can this child handle an emergency? If a stranger comes to the door, can this child handle safely that situation? If an accident occurs, does the child know enough first aid to take care of him or herself if he gets a cut or he falls down? Is there a neighbor close by that you are in touch with that you could say, keep an eye on the child, I'm just stepping out? So all of these things are things you look at, and you have to exercise good judgment and make a decision that is safe for the child.
Good.
So you imagine it would depend on the age of the child, the temperament of the child, where the parent is going, how far, what time of day, is it overnight, is it a few hours in the day? So parents just have to exercise good judgment.
There's an aspect about the child. The
Yes.
child himself.
Yes.
Does the child want to be at home?
Definitely. And that's an area that parents tend to neglect. Because you say, okay, my daughter is 8 years old and she helps me in the kitchen and she's responsible and I think she can handle herself. But have you asked the child, are you comfortable staying alone? And that's an important question, because that child who can function well with mommy or daddy close by may say, no, I'm scared. I'm scared that somebody is going to hurt me, right? I heard the news and a child was kidnapped, right? And we have a lot of things happening in the news. So it's important to assess the child's perception of their ability. Because if you put a child in a situation that generates that level of anxiety, you may actually be sowing a seed for a psychological or psychiatric problem in the future. That child may develop what we describe as separation anxiety, and thereafter have problems.
That's right. And once it's done once and they seem to be okay, in quotes,
the parent may continue to do it, you see, and do more damage to the child.
We just have a few minutes to wrap up this segment of the program. Let's get back to the signs. What if, as a neighbor, I were to observe some of the signs that you have outlined? What should be my response?
Okay, so Pastor Riley, you're asking tricky questions.
I'm so sorry.
And I mean, that is such a serious question, because people want to help. So you see a sign, you suspect. You can never be sure. You suspect. Or maybe you're sure. Maybe you hear the child getting beaten, and the child comes to you. What is your responsibility? I think the bottom line is the safety of the child. The safety of the child. So you can befriend that child, you can become a source of emotional support to that child, you can be there for that child in need, and that can be very helpful and protective, but it is your responsibility to report when you suspect that a child is being abused. And there are authorities to report that too. Children's Authority, they have a hotline that can be called, right? And if you think you prefer to encourage the child to seek help, there is a child line that children can call for themselves to seek help. Now, what do you do with the suspected abuser? No, I guess that's the tricky part. That's the tricky part, you see? Because I don't think it's so wise to just go and confront somebody of that they might be abusing their child. We had a very interesting finding when we did our Break the Silence project concerning child sexual abuse. Communities tend to protect themselves. Nobody wants to be identified as a community or a person in the community who is an abuser. So you have to be cautious. You really have to be cautious with that. But the bottom line is protect the child by reporting. Let the authorities do what they are trained to do. And when that child confides in you, you need to let them know, hey, I need to report this for your safety, so that the child does not feel that their trust is being violated.
I'm here with Dr. Sandra Reid, psychiatrist, dealing with the issue of child abuse. What about our children? We have some more important questions to treat with when we come back. Stay tuned.
Days filled with hunger, nights filled with fear, families torn asunder, gone is all that they hold dear. Who will offer hope and refuge in this hour of need? What you give the least of these, you give unto me. Country steeped in turmoil, a city now destroyed, a haunted look within the eyes of every girl and boy. Who will help this broken people fall into their knees? What what you give the least of these, you give unto me. A mother sits in mourning in the middle of the street, where hungry children wander with no shoes on their feet. There is a need much deeper than the physical can show. Light must pierce the darkness that they know. There is a love that's burning through the darkness and the strife, bringing hope and healing like the springtime bears new life. Reach out to your brother, help the wounded and the weak. What you give the least of these, you give unto me. Reach out to your brother, help the wounded and the weak. What you give the least of these, you give unto me. What you give the least of these, you give unto me.
I'm here with Dr. Sandra Reid, psychiatrist, as we treat with the whole question of child abuse. Wow, Doc, I want to ask you another tricky question, I suppose. I hope it's not too difficult. Why would anyone, and this is a clinical question,
Yes.
why would any adult want to abuse a helpless child?
Yeah. And I'm sure that's a question that has crossed the minds of many. And abusers might be thought of as bad people. That tends to be the response, a bad mother and a bad father. We don't have statistics, but I suspect that there are very, very few parents or adults who are just bad and intentionally and deliberately hurt a child. I would put maybe the sociopaths in society who engage in human trafficking for the purpose of gain would fall into that category, but they're fewer in terms of the number of children who are abused. I think I would choose to describe people who abuse as ill people. And not necessarily ill as in psychiatric disorder needing my intervention with medication, but psychologically ill and hurting people. So if we look at the very many reasons why, I think high up on the list would be those parents who are having difficulty coping. Life is very stressful. There are single parent homes, mother-led and father-led single parent homes. People are studying, people are juggling the finances, having 2 and 3 jobs, trying to make ends meet. Life is stressful. And if you are not coping well, which by the way is my definition of mental wellness, if you are not coping well, it's very possible that you might use a psychological term we describe as displacement. We see displacement in cartoons a lot. Boss shout at husband, husband goes home and shouts at wife, wife beats child, child kicks dog. That's displacement. You take out your frustration and anger on somebody or something that is helpless or more helpless than you are. So parents may in fact be engaging in abusive behaviors, and we're talking now about extreme discipline and physical abuse and so on, simply because they are frustrated and not coping.
So there could be a case where there is double abuse. I would call it double abuse, where the father is abusing the child directly,
Yes.
and the mother is protecting the father.
Yes, that's right. And that's a very subtle kind of abuse, because one would think, oh, mother is protecting father, that's okay with child. But that's emotional abuse, because the mother is not fulfilling her role of providing a safe environment for the child, right? So you're very right. That's double abuse, right? Now, another mechanism through which children might be abused, I call it, again, sick behavior, as in psychologically ill behavior, and abuse of power. So I am the parent, and I know what's best for you, and I tell you, you must do this or you must not do this. That could be emotional abuse. And you also have these kinds of misguided priorities. So I only have X amount of money and I need, oh gosh, the only example that comes to my mind is braids. Not a very good example, you know? So you can't get school books or you can't get snacks for this week, right? So misguided priorities, which are driven again by psychological issues that people can probably fix through counseling. And then we have situations where it's learned behavior, right? I heard a mother say once, yes, I beat her and I beat her the way I beat her. My mother used to beat me so and it didn't hurt me, right? So learned behavior, you've learned that this is the way you behave, not cognizant of the fact that it hurt you emotionally and physically, and you are now hurting your child emotionally and physically, right? And then of course we have the extremes, people who might be mentally ill. Again, that's a small proportion who express their symptomatology through abusive behaviors. But you know something? None of these things would happen so readily if our society wasn't such that children's rights were not important. We really have not been a society invested in the rights of the child. And when I say rights of the child, I don't mean the right of the child to say, I'm going out or I'm doing this. I'm simply talking about the right of a child to be safe, to be protected, to be loved, and to be nurtured. Yeah? So with that, it makes it easy for these parenting issues to arise and for children to be abused.
Now the damage has been done to the child, and this is perhaps a spin-off of the question of signs and symptoms. What are some of the possible side effects, maybe long-term side effects, that could affect the abused?
Yes, okay. So the short-term ones, children might be hurt and, you know, the issues of STDs and so with sexual abuse. But the long-term effects, and this is what leads them to the mental health professional. Now, I just wanted to put a scenario here. Let's imagine that from a very young age, a child is being abused physically and emotionally. Now, this is a child. Let's picture age, let's say 4 or 5. That child has to cope. And children use childish methods to cope because they're children. So that child may decide the only way I can cope is to just block out the emotion. So I block it out. And children, adults tell you that when they look back at childhood. I used to be sad, I used to cry, and then it just didn't matter anymore. I just stopped feeling. Now that child who has stopped feeling as a way of coping grows into adolescence and adulthood not feeling. What do you have? You have the makings of a sociopath. Because that person now could do anything and don't feel. They could con an old woman and don't feel. They could bully another child and don't feel. And that is the emergence of mental health issues. So you find that children who are abused through their infantile ways of coping sometimes end up with substance use disorders. They drink and they smoke at an early age to cope. They can end up with psychiatric disorders like depression and anxiety. They join peer groups where they feel more accepted and supported, and they can become gang members, and they may develop personality disorders, like the example I just gave. Personality disorders that lead them to be unable to trust others because they were so abused they couldn't trust the people who were supposed to love and take care of them. And personality disorders that increase their own risk of being an abuser.
The other side to that is, you said they could block off the feelings from 4.
Yes.
But what if when they reach 24, they now come in contact with those emotions? Is it possible? And they now begin to treat with the...
It can be explosive. You know, a common scenario as to how and when that happens in the context of relationships. So you're blocked off until you meet the right guy or the right girl, and you decide, I'm going to trust this one. Right. And you trust, and that relationship goes sour. Not necessarily a breakup, even though that can be a trigger too, but an infidelity or some betrayal of trust. And then you get an eruption of all of the emotions. It's as if you just open an old wound and all the pus comes out. Yeah, it can happen.
Now, let's bring God into this question.
Yes.
How do you go about convincing a child, whether the child is still a child or now an adult? Mm-hmm. Because you can be an adult and still operate as a child. Yes. But how do you convince the abused that God did not let this happen?
Wow, you see? And of course, you talk about child and adult. It's easier for an adult. But for a child who, I mean, this is mommy and daddy and I see, or this is neighbor and I see, I don't see God. What you're telling me about God? But I think children need to know that God is real and that God is love. We kind of toss that term about a lot. God is love, but God is love.
Yeah, but God is love and let this happen.
God is love. God is not man. God is love means that He will love you unconditionally. He will never let you down. He will never betray you. Man is tainted by sin. I mean, that may be a little abstract for a child to understand, but they need to know God will never fail. Even when the ones you love here on this earth fail you, God will never fail. And when you put your trust in Him, He will never betray you. And it is that same God who will help your friend or help your mommy or help your daddy to be a better person.
Right.
And I think children might be able to respond to that.
Beautiful. And of course, there are cases in the Bible you can cite where, God showed his love in spite of the deficiencies of man.
That's right.
Joseph's brothers got rid of him.
Yes.
That's his own flesh. He was their own flesh and blood.
That's right.
But they got rid of him.
Yes.
But did God love him any less?
That's right. Exactly.
You know.
And God loved Joseph, but he continued to love his brothers.
His brothers as well.
And that's reassuring to a child. Because when you report a case of abuse to the authorities, a child is the abuse continues. Am I now putting daddy in jail? Am I now going to make neighbor, lose his job or whatever? So the reassurance that God is also going to help your abuser will be good for a child.
Speaking of which, and this is the question I want us to close off with, how can God begin to help first the abused and then the abuser?
All right. Love heals. And by his unconditional love, God heals the abused. I think that God has a special place in his heart for people who have been victims of abuse, and he's willing to show them in a very real way that he's there for them. He has their back if they would just trust him and cry out to him. The abuser, on the other hand, sometimes it's hard for somebody to face up to the fact that I have done what I have done. The abuser needs to be reassured that you still have to stand the consequences. You have to take responsibility for your action. But in the midst of that, God will forgive you. He will love you. He will help you. So reach out to him as well.
Okay, thank you so much for taking the time. And I hope you'll be back with us on JC 24/7 soon.
Okay, I will most certainly make that a date.
Very good. Thank you again.
Yes.
Jesus himself said, "Suffer little children to come unto me." He did not say, "Let the little children suffer." Allow them to come unto Jesus. If you are an abused or if you are an abuser, you can come unto Jesus and he will give you rest. I don't know how he does it, but I know he can. Just trust him. If you can't trust anybody else, you can surely trust JC 24/7. See you next time.
Thank you for viewing JC 24/7. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and remember to inspire your living as you prepare for heaven. You can get it all on JC 24/7.